Welcome to Brainfluence. I'm Roger Dooley. A quick reminder for our audio listeners, all episodes, plus many more Brainfluence briefs are available on my YouTube channel. Way back in 1969, a psychologist named Robert Zajonc recruited 72 cockroaches and had them run mazes. They ran in front of an audience. Here's the weird part. The audience wasn't lab assistants or undergrad psych majors earning credit. It was other cockroaches. The watcher bugs were sealed in little clear plastic boxes right next to the track. The paper doesn't tell us whether or not they cheered. Some roach runners got an easy job, run straight down a path to get away from a bright light. Others got a harder job, a maze with twists and turns. And with that audience of fellow roaches watching, Zajonc observed something strange. The roaches got faster on the easy path and slower on the difficult maze. By now you're probably wondering, who cares how fast a cockroach runs? I guess some people do. Anecdotally, I can tell you that New York City roaches scatter 3 times faster than their laid-back Texas relatives. But this experiment was never about cockroach athletic performance. And by the end of this episode, you'll see why the strangest-looking, most bizarre experiments in behavioral science are usually the best ones, and how the thinking behind them can transform the way your team runs your marketing experiments. So what was Zajonc actually studying? It was something called social facilitation, the question of whether being watched changes performance. Here's the design problem. If you test that on humans, things get complicated. People care what the audience thinks. They get self-conscious. They show off, or maybe they choke. It's hard to separate whether the presence of others changes performance or worrying about others. A cockroach solves that problem. It can sense that other roaches are nearby, but it almost certainly doesn't care what they think of its lap time. If you remove self-consciousness, and if the audience still changes performance, you've isolated something real about the mechanism. That's not a silly experiment. That's a very precise one that happens to look silly. Remember this study because there's a twist coming at the end of the episode. 50 years later, someone reran it and the story changed. I'll get to that in a little bit. First, let me give you the frame that ties this whole episode together. It comes from Dan Ariely, who I've had on this show a couple of times. He recently wrote a short piece about how he comes up with his experiments, and I really like his analogy. An experiment is a painting, not a photograph. A painter usually doesn't try to reproduce every detail of a scene. They capture the essence of it. A good experiment works the same way. You start with a real-world problem. People don't save enough for retirement. People quit taking their medication. People abandon projects halfway through. Then you boil that problem down to a single principle. Next, you build a tiny self-contained world that includes that principle and almost nothing else. Finally, you mess with it and watch what happens. The question a good researcher is really asking is actually quite simple. What's the essence of this problem? That explains why so much behavioral research looks, frankly, a little crazy from the outside. The weirdness isn't sloppiness or weirdness for its own sake. It's what's left after you strip away everything that isn't the essence. When I interviewed Ariely years ago, I teased him about this. Other researchers need multi-million-dollar brain scanners. Dan often seems to need little more than paper, a pencil, and a few grad students. His answer stuck with me. He said, "I'm not really a good scientist. I'm more of a behavioral hacker." He starts with something in the real world that isn't working and asks how you could poke at it, even imperfectly, to understand it better. Keep that phrase in mind, behavioral hacker, because I'm going to walk you through 4 experiments that sound like pranks and turn out to be very useful findings in behavioral science. A scary bridge, a beer menu, a pile of Legos, and an overpriced energy drink. Let's start with the bridge. British Columbia, 1974. The Capilano Canyon has 2 ways across. One is a narrow suspension bridge, wobbly, swaying, 230 feet above rocks and rapids. The other is a solid wooden bridge crossing a calm stream just 10 feet down. Researchers, Donald Dutton and Arthur Aaron, station an attractive woman at the end of each bridge. As men came across, she asked them to write a short story about an ambiguous picture and then gave each one her phone number, supposedly in case he had questions about the study. Here's what happened. Of the men who crossed the terrifying bridge, half called her. From the safe bridge, only 2 out of 16. and the stories written by the scary bridge men contain noticeably more romantic and sexual imagery. Now, was this a study about bridges? Of course not. The essence being tested was something called misattribution of arousal. When you're frightened, your body changes. Your heart pounds, your palms sweat. Your brain notices these changes and looks for an explanation. And it doesn't always pick the right one. It picks the most interesting one available. And on that bridge, the most interesting explanation in sight was an attractive stranger. The bridge was never the point. It was just a cheap, reliable way to spike a man's heart rate that had nothing to do with romance. Now, full disclosure, the methodology of this study has been criticized for 50 years. Men weren't randomly assigned to bridges, and you could argue that cautious guys who chose the safe crossing might also be more reluctant to cold call a woman. The sample size was tiny. But here's the good news. Replications using roller coasters and horror movies confirm the arousal attraction transfer is real. It's just more modest and shorter-lived than originally thought. And notice one more piece of elegant design. Why not just ask the men how attracted they felt? Because that answer would be worthless. If you've followed my work for any length of time, you know this is one of the foundational truths of neuromarketing. People can't or won't reliably tell you why they did what they did, explain how they feel, or predict what they will do in the future. The scientists didn't need a questionnaire. They only needed a phone number and a count of who called. This raises a fun question. If people can't explain their own behavior, what happens when you make them announce their choices out loud in public? That question brings us to the beer. This one is Ariely's own favorite, and it's one with a direct payoff for marketers. He and Jonathan Levav ran it at the Caroline Brewery in Chapel Hill. Tables of diners were offered a free sample from a menu of 4 beers. At some tables, everyone ordered the normal way, out loud, one after another, while the rest of the table listened. At other tables, everyone wrote their choice privately on a card. The tables ordering out loud chose significantly more variety. Nobody, it seems, wants to be the 4th person at the table to say, "I'll have the same thing." But here's the twist, and this is the part I love. The people who ordered out loud enjoyed their beer less. All that variety seeking produced regret. And the happiest drinker at the table in those groups was the person who ordered first, the only one who chose without hearing anyone else's pick. The essence here isn't beer. It's what happens when a private preference becomes part of a public performance. People stop choosing what they want and start choosing what their choice says about them. Now, swap out the brewery table. Make it a boardroom where opinions are given in order of seniority. A Zoom call where the boss weighs in first. A couple choosing options at a car dealership while watching each other's reactions. The same distortion kicks in. The later you speak, the less your stated preference reflects your actual preference. One quick note, I'm not aware of an authoritative replication of the beer study, but the mechanism, public settings distorting private preferences, shows up all over the literature. So far, we've messed with people's hearts and their pride. What happens when you mess with the meaning of their work? That one needed Legos. This was yet another Ariely experiment. Students were paid to build 40-piece Lego Bionicle figures, a little less money for each one they completed until they decided to stop. In one condition, every finished Bionicle went on the desk, where the builder could watch their completed work product grow. In the other condition, Ariely has described this as the Sisyphus condition. While the student built their second figure, the experimenter destroyed the first one right in front of them and dumped the pieces back into the box. Let me be clear about what did not change. The task, the pay, everything. The only difference was watching your work get demolished. The builders who could see their work accumulate made about 10.5 Bionicles. The Sisyphus group quit after about 7. When Ariely told me about this study, he mentioned a detail I think is the real finding. Beforehand, people predicted that meaningless condition would cost maybe 1 Bionicle of output. The real gap was 3 times that. We know meaning matters, but we hugely underestimate how much it matters. And there was something darker in the data. In the normal condition, the students who genuinely love Legos worked longest. Passion predicted persistence, exactly as you'd expect. In the Sisyphus condition, that relationship vanished entirely. Loving the work no longer mattered. As Dan put it to me, we have sucked the joy out of them. I'm sure you don't need the business translation spelled out because you've seen it happen. The reorg that made 6 months of a team's work useless. the report you slaved over but nobody read, the project canceled the week before launch. The leaders making these decisions didn't cut anyone's pay, but they dismantled their bionicles right in front of them. And the best people, the ones who love the work, are exactly the ones this behavior breaks. When we first moved to Texas, we had some construction done in our house. More than once, we saw the workers building stone walls weren't following the blueprints. Each time, the project manager said, "Tell them to keep working, I'll be there in the morning to sort it out." And in the morning, he had the workers tear down their work and redo it. I didn't have Ariely's research then, but I couldn't imagine anything more demotivating than being told to destroy a day's work of one's own work laying heavy stone blocks in Texas summer heat. Okay, one study left, and I've saved it for last because it's the one where a pure marketing variable acts like a drug. Babashiv, Ziv Karman, and Ariely sold students a Sobe energy drink, the kind that promises to up your mental focus. Some students paid full price, others got it at a discount. Then everyone sat down to solve word puzzles. The full price group solved 5.8 puzzles on average. The discount group managed just 4.2. Same drink, absolutely identical. The only thing that changed was the price tag, and the subject's brains subconsciously adjusted the product's actual potency to match. The price wasn't a mere aspect of the product. The price was acting like a pharmaceutical. And of the 4 studies today, this is the one with the strongest replication record. The same team later showed that full-price placebo painkillers relieved more pain than discounted ones. Other labs have reproduced the marketing placebo effect using scarcity and packaging instead of price. Check my recent video about how the same wine with a higher price tag tastes better. This effect is real, it's robust, and it's been verified from multiple angles. I've been writing about this for years because the implication is one most companies still refuse to believe. When you discount a product, you may not just be trimming your margin, you may be making the product objectively worse for the customer. The experience itself can degrade. That's the potential hidden risk from every promotion, every coupon, every 20% off your first order. Now, sometimes discounting is the right move, but you should know that it can change the product experience. So let's wrap up. Here's what I see when companies run experiments. The methodology is usually fine. The problem is nobody asked what the essence was before hitting run. You find out that the orange button beat the blue button on the landing page, which is nice, but it transfers to nothing else. Here are 4 things the cockroach and beer scientists do that most growth teams don't. 1. Specify the principle before you pick the variable. Don't test headline A versus headline B. Test, does reducing perceived risk increase signups? The first gives you a one-time winner. The second gives you a principle you can use everywhere. 2. Exaggerate the manipulation. Ariely didn't gently dial down the meaning in the Lego study. He tore the models apart in front of the builders. If you can't detect an effect at full strength, don't waste your time A/B testing a diluted version. Test the maximum first, then dial back. 3. Remove everything that isn't the essence. The bridge study didn't need an app, a personality inventory, and a follow-up survey. It needed a phone number and a count of who called. Every variable you add is noise you'll have to explain later. Adding friction reduces participation. 4. Flip the essence and see if the behavior flips. This is the step almost nobody does. If your explanation is right, reversing the principle should reverse the result. And that 4th rule brings us back to those cockroaches, because I told you there would be a twist. In 2020, 50 years after Zajonc's original experiment, German researchers ran a pre-registered replication with a much bigger sample of roaches. The audience effect on the hard maze held up. Roaches still slowed down. But on the other part, the speed up on the easy task, those roaches ran slower too. The replicators also noted, a bit awkwardly, that the famous original paper never ran a standard statistical analysis on its widely publicized result. Now, is that bad news? Maybe for the textbooks, sure, but that's science working exactly how it's supposed to. And it was only possible because the original experimental design was so simple, so stripped to its essence, that someone could rerun it half a century later and find out exactly what survived. There's a line from my conversations with Ariely that you should keep in mind when a test of yours doesn't work. He said, "There's nothing quite as humiliating as having an idea, testing it, and watching it fail." And he meant that as praise for testing, because the alternative, never finding out, is worse. Our intuition is surprisingly unreliable, and the whole point of these strange little experiments is to find out where it fails us. So here's your takeaway. The best experiments look silly to outsiders precisely because they aren't about their obvious subject. Not roaches, not bridges, not beer. Before you and your team plan your next test, ask one question. What do we actually believe is happening here? If nobody can state the essence in a sentence, you don't have an experiment yet. And when you do get a beautiful result, don't forget the roaches. Rerun it before you build an important strategy on it. Remember, keep it simple, find the essence, and be nice to your cockroaches. Thanks for tuning in.